Winter 1098, Antioch. The Knights of Christ are gathered around a fire, and they are eating human flesh. This is not a legend. This is not an exaggeration. It is recorded in 10 separate Christian chronicles, written by eyewitnesses within 20 years of the event. The soldiers of the First Crusade, men who marched under the cross, who prayed before every battle, were eating the dead.
How did an army of God reach this point? 8 months of siege. 1 in 7 Crusaders dying from starvation every week. They had eaten their horses, then the leather from their saddles, then grass scraped from the stones of the city walls. When the dead began to outnumber the living, someone made a decision that no chronicle names and no historian has fully explained. They crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed.
They had taken the city. That was supposed to be the victory. On June 3rd, 1098, after 8 months of siege, the Crusaders finally broke through the walls of Antioch. They had won. But within hours, before they could rest, before they could eat, the army of Kerboga, the military governor of Mosul, arrived outside the walls. 80,000 soldiers. The Crusaders had walked into a trap. The besiegers had become the besieged. The leaders panicked. Stephen of Blois, one of the most senior commanders, escaped by night, climbing down the walls on a rope. He rode to the Byzantine emperor and told him the crusade was finished. Finished. Other knights followed him into the darkness. The priests prayed, the sick lay in rows and died. And then, into this collapsing world, walked a man that no one had noticed before. Dirty, poor, trembling, with an impossible story to tell. His name was Peter Bartholomew, a peasant from Provence, a known drinker, a man of no rank, no education, no military record, the kind of man armies forget existed. He told the bishops and the counts that St. Andrew had appeared to him 5 times, that the saint had taken him in a vision to the church of St. Peter inside the city walls and shown him something buried beneath the floor, something that would save them all. The bishop looked at him with cold eyes and said nothing. One man believed him. Raymond of Toulouse, Count of Provence, commander of the largest Crusader regiment, looked at Peter Bartholomew and saw something the bishop did not. Not a drunk, not a fool, something else. He ordered the search to begin. What happened next would save the crusade, break Peter Bartholomew apart, and leave a question that 900 years of history have never answered. Was it real, or was it the most consequential lie ever told? The First Crusade began in 1096. Pope Urban II had called on the Christian world to take Jerusalem from the Muslims. What answered his call was not just an army, it was a wave. Knights and bishops, merchants and monks, peasants who had never left their village, all of them walking south and east toward a city most had never seen. Among them, somewhere in the vast crowd, was a man from Provence named Peter Bartholomew. Nobody remembered him joining, nobody remembered him at all. December 1097. The Crusaders had been besieging Antioch for 2 months. The city was enormous. 5 miles of walls, 400 towers, built by the Romans and reinforced for centuries. Inside, the Seljuk garrison had enough food for years. Outside, the Crusaders were beginning to starve. It was in this darkness, in this hunger, that Peter Bartholomew had his first vision. St. Andrew came to him in the night, sat beside him, and spoke. St. Andrew showed him a church, the Cathedral of St. Peter, inside the walls of Antioch itself. And beneath the floor of that church, Andrew said, lay a relic, the Holy Lance, the spear that the Roman centurion Longinus had used to pierce the side of Christ on the cross, the most sacred weapon in Christian history, buried, waiting. And if the Crusaders found it and carried it into battle, Andrew told him, God would give them victory. Peter woke up and said nothing. He stayed silent for weeks. St. Andrew came back, then again, then again.
5 visits in total, each more urgent than the last. In February 1098, Peter began losing his sight. Most historians believe it was starvation. Peter believed it was punishment for his silence, for his failure to deliver the message. He was going blind in a dying army, carrying a secret he was too afraid to speak. Finally, he could not stay silent any longer. He went to find Raymond of Toulouse.
Raymond listened. Unlike Bishop Adhemar, who dismissed Peter with cold theological logic, the Count of Toulouse heard something different. Perhaps he saw a man too frightened and too broken to be lying. Perhaps he simply needed to believe.
Either way, he gave the order. Excavate the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. 12 men dug for an entire day. The stone was hard, the hole grew deeper, and they found nothing. The crowd watching fell silent. Peter Bartholomew climbed down into the hole himself. He disappeared into the darkness of the hole. The digging stopped. Everyone watched. Then his hands appeared above the edge, and in them, a piece of iron. Old, corroded, a spearhead. Peter was weeping. He could barely speak. He held it above his head and screamed that this was it, the lance of the Lord, found exactly where St. Andrew had said it would be. The cathedral erupted. Men who had not prayed in weeks fell to their knees. Outside, the army of Kerboga waited. Inside, something had just changed. The lance changed everything before a single blow was struck. Within hours of its discovery, the mood inside Antioch shifted. Men who had been lying on the ground from hunger stood up. Men who had been planning to escape over the walls at night changed their minds. The priests announced a miracle. The soldiers announced a victory that had not yet happened. Peter Bartholomew, the drunk, the nobody, was suddenly the most important man in the crusade. 3 days of fasting and prayer. That was the preparation. Men who had nothing left to eat fasted voluntarily because the lance demanded it. They prayed in shifts through the night. They confessed their sins. They sharpened their swords. Modern psychologists would call it a mass shift in belief. When a group in crisis receives a signal powerful enough to override the body's physical limits. The Crusaders called it God. Either way, it worked. June 28th, 1098. The gates of Antioch opened. What came out was not an army by any conventional measure. It was a skeleton. Starving men in rusted armor, horses too weak to gallop, banners torn by months of siege. Raymond of Toulouse carried the Holy Lance at the front of the column. They marched toward the army of Kerboga. 80,000 soldiers, rested, supplied, waiting on an open plain. The mathematics of war said this was suicide. Then something happened that no military historian has fully explained. Some crusaders began crying out that they could see riders, celestial cavalry on white horses, bearing white banners, led by St. George himself, charging alongside them. Most scholars believe these were hallucinations, the result of extreme starvation and religious ecstasy combined. But the effect was real. The Crusaders accelerated. The weak became fast. The dying became dangerous. And Kerboga's army, disciplined, rested, vastly superior, began to hesitate. Kerboga's army broke. Not slowly, suddenly. Within minutes of contact, the flanks collapsed. Units that had never been defeated turned and ran. The Crusaders, who by any physical measure should have lost in the first charge, pursued them for miles. Historians point to several factors: internal political divisions in Kerboga's coalition, poor tactical decisions, the terrain. But all of them acknowledge the same uncomfortable truth. The psychological effect of the lance was the decisive variable. A piece of iron changed the outcome of a battle.
There was one more weapon that no one had planned. Weeks earlier, during the worst of the famine, Crusaders had eaten the bodies of the dead. The news had spread through every Muslim garrison in Syria. Commanders who had never considered surrender began to reconsider. Reports described the Crusaders as inhuman, bloodthirsty savages who could not be stopped, who ate their enemies. Several cities sent terms before the Crusaders even arrived. The most shameful act of the crusade had become, accidentally, its most effective psychological weapon.
The crusade was saved. Jerusalem was within reach. And Peter Bartholomew, the man who had made it possible, should have been celebrated. Instead, a war began. Not with swords, with words. The Norman faction, followers of Bohemond of Taranto, had never believed the lance was real. They said it openly now. Peter had planted it himself. He had jumped into that hole with a piece of iron hidden under his robe. The man who saved the crusade was being called a fraud. And the army that had just won an impossible battle was splitting in two. Peter's visions did not stop after the battle. They accelerated. St. Andrew kept coming. Christ himself appeared. The recently dead Bishop Adamar appeared, and Peter announced that the bishop was burning in hell for having doubted the lance. Then came the vision that turned even his supporters against him. Peter declared that God had commanded him to identify the sinners within the crusading army and have them executed. The drunk from Provence was now claiming the power of life and death over knights and nobles. The room went cold.
Arnulf of Rojas, chaplain to Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, made the challenge official. He demanded that Peter prove the lance was genuine. The method? Ordeal by fire, an ancient test. 2 piles of dry olive branches, each 13 feet long, 4 feet high, set alight. Peter would walk between them, carrying the lance. If he emerged unharmed, God had spoken. If he burned, the lance was false. Peter did not hesitate. He demanded the trial himself. April 8, 1999, Good Friday. The flames would reach 40 feet into the sky. The entire army assembled. Priests stood barefoot. The wood was lit. The flames rose 40 feet, consuming the air above the corridor between the 2 pyres. Peter Bartholomew fasted for 4 days before this moment. He stood at the edge of the fire, holding the lance, and did not look back. He walked in. What happened next depends entirely on who you read. Raymond of Aguilers, who loved Peter, wrote that he walked through unharmed and was only hurt when the celebrating crowd crushed him in their rush to touch him. Fulcher of Chartres, who doubted Peter from the beginning, wrote that he was burned alive.
Peter Bartholomew died on April 20th, 1099, 12 days after the fire. Whatever happened inside those flames, his body did not survive what came after. On his deathbed, he spoke his last words, recorded by those present. "I fabricated nothing. Everything I told you came from God and the apostles. You will see the fulfillment of my words if you faithfully serve God." Then he died, and was buried on the spot where he had walked through the fire. Jerusalem fell 86 days later. Peter Bartholomew never saw it. The lance was discredited after his death. Raymond of Toulouse, its greatest offender, lost political power within the crusade. Godfrey of Bouillon became the first ruler of Jerusalem. A piece of iron that had saved an army, won a battle, and changed the course of history was quietly set aside. But the question it leaves behind has never been set aside. Was Peter Bartholomew a fraud who convinced himself? A starving man whose hunger turned into visions? Or someone who found something real beneath that church floor, carried it through fire, and died before anyone believed him? The flame went out. The question never did.